dar we will give the speakers their allotted amount of time, and we will have, I hope, time for a little bit of questions at the end. So we are more or less ready. Our first presenter, actually, I get off easy because I can say for each one, they're so well known they don't need an introduction, which will cut our time a little bit there. Our first speaker is Bruce Little, who's going to talk about the discarded image, making sense of it all. And Bruce, you're on.
I assume that's clapping. The applause was just for the fact that I made it here. I shall expect nothing at the end. C.S. Lewis, in The Discarded Image, the introduction to medieval Renaissance literature, it's based on a series of lectures that he gave more than once at Oxford. The book is published after his death in 1964, but the preface was written in 1962. Lewis explains that his intention was to provide a way of enjoyment of medieval literature. Lewis explains that his intention and his hope was that if, by giving a tolerable, though incomplete, outfit required beforehand and taken along with one, it might lead in. Lewis highlights the medieval model of the universe, which was built on the metaphysical realist view of the medieval model, that is, the model of the universe. And of course, Lewis was a metaphysical realist himself, and he had great appreciation for the medieval model. His assumption is that only by understanding the model can one appreciate the literature which arose out of and was supported by the intellectual, theological context out of which the model arose. It was the medieval imagination, he claims, that built the model of the universe, but it was based on their theological beliefs centered in creation, and that should be spelled with a large C. It was a model that made some sense of man and his universe. It was, as we would say, a view of the world. The medievalist used imagination to craft a mental model of the universe that honored both coherence and correspondence. As Lewis put it, quote, "It was a whole organization of their theology, their science, their history into a single, complex, harmonious mental model of the universe. As a model, it created order by obeying the principle, a place for everything and everything in its right place." I will leave the discussion of medieval literature to those far more qualified than myself, and we have heard much about that at this conference. But as a philosopher, or I assume to be one, whether I am in reality or not, will not be discussed here. My interest in the medieval's use of imagination in crafting a mental model of the universe based on their theological beliefs. The model was forged their beliefs into a coherent whole that would correspond to the world as it was. And what some think of as a meta-narrative, though maybe not precisely. He calls it a model. The idea of coherence speaks to the unity of the model itself, that is within itself, while at the same time it would correspond to the way the world or the way things are, hence making sense of it all. Both are required of a an attractive mental model, whether you're a medievalist or you are a modernist. For the medieval, the model was not the end, but was a way, or we might say a door, to lead others into the truth that was behind the model. To gather coherence and correspondence of the model made sense of life. It gave answers to the questions of meaning. Consequently, it created an affective, that is, in affections, interest in the human heart. It answered the desire for meaning. This was important if men were to give a hearing to the truth behind the model. As Richard Weaver, literature, English scholar at Chicago University years ago, Weaver wrote, "We do not undertake to reason about anything until we have been first drawn to it by an affective interest." The medieval model gave a door into conversation regarding the truth behind the model itself. In light of this, the thesis defended here is that the medieval model provides an example of combining reason and imagination in doing Christian apologetics. He argues also about this is that the medievalists created a vision for all life, resulting in an account of reality that corresponded to the world and formed a coherent whole, or as Lewis marvels, combined splendor, call that correspondence, sobriety, balance, and coherence in the same degree. He emphasizes that understanding the medieval model requires distinguishing the core belief from the attendant imagining. That is, the truthfulness of the belief is not established by the imagination. Rather, the imagination gives meaning to the beliefs found by reason. The medieval model was the image discarded by the moderns. Why? Well, because it no longer fit their naturalist vision of reality, such as we heard in the last panel. Lewis makes it clear that he's not suggesting that imagination creates truth. It only gives meaning when informed by certain beliefs. According to Lewis, quote, "Reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. Truth gained by reason provides the substance for the imagination, which works to give meaning to the appearances of life." For Lewis, imagination works with the beliefs to construct a model that fits everything together, making sense of things, or we might say, giving meaning. In his explanation of his own longing, he speaks of it as being unrequited desire. He explains, quote, "But this desire, even when there is no hope or possibility of satisfaction, continues to be prized and even to be preferred in anything else in the world by those who have been touched by it." The medieval model fitted the appearances of the world into a coherent whole by way that corresponded to the world as it really is. As Lewis adds, quote, "A model must be built which gets everything in without clash, and it can do this only by becoming intricate, by mediating its unity through a great and finely ordered multiplicity." That is dealing with the one in the many, rather long history of that debate and discussion within philosophy, even since the pre-Socratics. Another way of saying it is that the model fits the appearances, or what we call particulars, that's things that are created, into a framework of universals. It corresponds, that is, to reality. This creates not just an intellectual interest, but more importantly, I think, an affective interest. An affective interest is the appeal of the model because it answers the questions of the human heart, longing for or desiring meaning. Lewis makes it plain what he is doing with the idea of a model when he writes, quote, "But it must not be supposed that I am in any sense putting forward imagination as an organ for truth. We're not talking of truth, but of meaning, meaning which is an antecedent condition both of truth and falsehood, whose antithesis is not error, but nonsense. I am a rationalist. For me, reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. The foundation for the model comes from the truth of things as grasped by reason, while imagination fleshes out all those beliefs into a coherent model. However, whatever is fleshed out, so to speak, it must do justice to the form as set out by the foundation, but it is not truth itself. In a Christian view, it is the meaning the model gives by which the unbeliever might be drawn into the truth which lies behind the model. I think this is especially important in light of the antagonism towards Christianity today, especially in the West. Understanding the role of imagination to construct a model has, on average, not been used by evangelicals in their evangelistic efforts, particularly in their literature. Most often, the focus is only on the belief set out in a propositional way. This is not to say that propositions have no place in the work, but that's a different concern from what is being argued here. Little is done using the organ of imagination to create a mental model of the universe from their theological beliefs. Lewis reminds us that the work of the organ of imagination, of reason, as the natural organ of truth, those two things are different, but they're not divorced in the model-making enterprise. Lewis admits that the medieval model is more than an intellectual matter. He writes, the medieval model that it, quote, delights me as I believe it delighted our ancestors. Few constructions of the imagination seem to me to have combined splendor, sobriety, and coherence in the same degree. The model delighted Lewis precisely because it had a built-in significance, in two senses. One, as having a significant form, that is its admirable design, he says, and as a manifestation of the wisdom and the goodness that created it. The model was a work of imagination using medieval theology from which it constructed a view of the universe providing meaning to the human heart. As a model built on the organ of truth and elaborated on by the organ of imagination, it gave meaning to the questions of life on the Christian vision of reality. According to Lewis, the medieval model opened the door through which others might be ushered into an interesting matter of a discussion which otherwise they might have had no interest at all. And the interest is given because it produces or presents questions that are asked of life. Lewis remarks, every model is a construct of answered questions. However, models, if they are to have an affective interest to human inquiry, must demonstrate both coherence and correspondence. An effective power of a model is proportionate to its coherence as a whole and its correspondence with reality. Now, a contrary model, one might remember that the first movie titled Avatar. It has been said that when people left the cinema after viewing the film, they were depressed. It was theorized by social scientists that this resulted from the fact that the view of the world presented in the film, which was very charming and enticing, it was maybe even somewhat coherent, loosely speaking. However, when people walked out onto the street, it was all too obvious. It did not fit or correspond to the world in which they lived. It was a model that failed both at coherence as a system and correspondence to external reality. A matter of correspondence is important because by nature, humanity prefers external order to chaos. In fact, that's how culture develops, as we try to bring order out of chaos, truth out of the lie, beauty out of ugliness. Human beings instinctively are drawn to order and resolution, even if they have no explanation why this causes them to prefer one solution over another. Therefore, any attempt at model making that does not deliver both coherence and correspondence is not really attractive either to the head or the heart. And this follows Weaver's words again. We do not undertake to reason about anything until we have been drawn to it by an affective interest. During Lewis's day, England had become increasingly atheistic in its vision of reality, denying anything that existed above experience. The world which Lewis inhabited was one in intellectual and theological transition. The world which Lewis, the model of the world that emerged in the 1960s, but it was afoot before that, was named post-modernity or postmodernity, which is, I think, a misnomer, but we'll not debate that. It was a model which was not a model on their own, by their own voice. It was built on a vision of reality that denied objective reality, and therefore it denied objective truth. A poster child for postmodernity, historian Richard Tarnas, made this clear when he writes, "Properly speaking, therefore, there is no postmodern worldview, not even the possibility of one. The postmodern paradigm is by its nature fundamentally subversive to all paradigms, for at its core is the awareness of reality as being once multiple, local, temporal, and without demonstrable foundation." And I say, how wonderful. Postmodernist Richard Rorty approvingly noted that Western culture, which centers around the notion of truth, a search for truth, a tradition which runs from Greek philosophers through the Enlightenment, is a clearest example of the attempt to find one's existence by turning away from solidarity to objectivity. Now, you must understand that by what he means by solidarity, it simply means that people are no longer judged by individual beliefs, but they are only the beliefs of their group identity. They were the arbitrators of truth, they were, but only for their own truth. They would call it truth, but they would let you have your own truth as well. In fact, by postmodernists' own admission, it was impossible to build a coherent model on their view of reality. However, such a view did not correspond with reality. Such a view, if it would have been taken, would have thrown science into chaos. It is not surprising then, by the end of the 20th century, eminent biologist, atheist Edward Wilson an opponent of postmodernity, pointed out the failure and danger of the postmodern project. He wrote, "Reality, they, the postmodernists, propose, is a state constructed by the mind, not perceived by it. In the most extravagant version of this constructivism, there is no real reality, no objective truth, eternal to mental activity, only rivaling versions disseminated by ruling social groups." Now, he was not an evangelical Christian, though he started out that way. He was at one time, grew up in a Southern Baptist home, I think in Mississippi. Not only was the postmodern project a failure socially and intellectually, but it was also destructive to the work of science, as pointed out by Wilson. There was also the Humanist Manifesto 2000, in which Paul Kurtz, Wilson, and I believe 100 biologists around the world all signed, in which they denounced postmodernity as both dangerous and intellectually dishonest. Now you see, if postmodernity couldn't give us the model, so it seemed there was a need to return to model making again with a different vision of reality, and that reality was defined as naturalism. So at the beginning of the 21st century, another model emerged from the world of science known as scientific naturalism. On this, Paul Kurtz writes, and this is from the Humanist Manifesto 2000, "Scientific naturalism holds a form of non-reductive materialism." Now that would take some time to unpack here, but they want to make clear they're non-reductive materialists. The natural processes and events are best accounted for by the reference to material causes. It was a claim that scientific naturalism enables human beings to construct a coherent worldview, disentangled, they say, from metaphysics or theology and based on the sciences. Note that the model spoke of a coherence, but it did not address the problem of correspondence, and it denied metaphysical reality. Wilson, speaking for this model, writes, quote, "Science offers the highest metaphysics of its age. It was a thoroughly human construct driven by the truth that we are to dream, persist to discover, explain, and dream again, thereby plunging repeatedly into new terrain, and the world will somehow come clearer, and we will grasp the true strangeness of our universe." Some effort. Although the postmodern model did capture many of the minds of the general population, no one can live consistently with it, so they merely pretended to agree with it and live as reality dictates. However, scientists turned away from the postmodern project, offering in its place scientific naturalism as a superior model by which to live. The prescient Lewis saw the conclusion of scientific naturalism, I believe, in his That Hideous Strength, which is a rather chilling story that shows the end of such models. They resist meaning and purpose while turning humanity into objects to be manipulated. Furthermore, the model is intellectually impoverished and without effective attraction. What we have in the discarded image is Lewis's lament that the medieval model, as he calls it, has been discarded by the moderns. Lewis believed that the medieval model was preferred understanding of reality, which was close to Plato's view and was Christianized by both Augustine and Thomas. Lewis understood a man's heart bent toward having a way of thinking about the world that made sense. He also knew that if Christians were to use imagination to create a model that would have an affective interest, it would also be consistent with Christian theology. Otherwise, there'd be no need to engage in the project in the first place as Christians. However, he knew the difficulty of speaking as if there was objective truth, just as we find today. Lewis confesses, quote, "In lecturing to the popular audiences, I repeatedly found that it's almost impossible to make them understand that I recommend Christianity because I thought its affirmations to be objectively true. They simply were not interested in the question of truth or falsehood. You may have found that to be the case where you live. Disinterest in objective truth has only strengthened over time. We live in a world awash with relativism, cynicism, and moral confusion, for truth has fallen in the streets, as Isaiah 59:14 says. It was very much like in Lewis's day. The models of the universe on offer are failing miserably. It is true, interest in objective truth is at a low ebb. With Lewis, we must believe that it is still possible to reach the modern man with the truth of Christianity by drawing on the example of the medieval model. This approach has in places been referred to as imaginative apologetics, though I'm not sure the people who use it understand it, as modeled by C.S. Lewis. It's a model that challenges intellectually as well as creates an affective interest as it makes sense of all that is. In closing, let me remind you of two things. One is that any apologetic value without the effective work of the God the Holy Spirit is rather useless. Lewis agrees. Two, we must not think that this approach will reach everybody. However, with Dr. Ransom in Out of the Silent Planet, who said, let us believe that if our serious efforts, we could even affect some 1% of the people familiarized with certain ideas. If we could even affect 1% of our readers to change over from the conception of space to the conception of heaven, we would have made a beginning. I would say for our time that we could affect, if we could affect in 1% of our hearers a change over from the conception of naturalism to the conception of Christian theism, we should have at least made a beginning. It is true that objective truth and falsity are ignored in much of the West, but let us still follow Lewis's example and labor to show correspondence, coherence in the beauty of the Christian model that answers the questions being asked, giving meaning to the human heart. I am reminded from another great author, I am reminded of Gandalf's words to Frodo. Frodo says, "Oh, I wish it need not have happened in my time." Gandalf says, "So do I, and so do a lot who live and see such times. But that's not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what we will do with the time that's given us." Thank you.
Very good, and kept right to the time. That'll hopefully leave us some discussion time at the end. Our next speaker is the Reverend Dr. Andrew Lazo, who's going to talk about Mythopoetic Modernism. C.S. Lewis and the Re-Enchanted Academy. Andrew.
Thank you. I hope to deal with the Let's see, I don't know what I did with my clicker.
There's a clicker here. Is that...
Oh, that might be the one. Oh. And we should have a PowerPoint because I want to begin by talking about bicycles. And I'm supposed to follow a quote by Gandalf? That was brilliant. Thank you, Dr. Little.
Just to show my objectivity, I'm not taking this off of his time.
Okay, thank you.
Here we go, I hope. Excellent.
Great. Thank you. Well, I do want to begin by talking about bicycles. Here are Jack and Warnie Lewis as young boys in Ireland riding their bicycles. I know that Professor Ricky today spoke a little bit about that marvelous essay in Present Concerns talking about bicycles. And he talked about the 4 levels of enchantment. Do you remember that? Or can I go over them for just a moment? Of course, the first age is the age of unenchantment. When you see a bicycle and it makes no sense to you, you don't know how to ride, you fear falling off, that's the unenchanted age. The next age is once you get on the bicycle and it begins to work for you and you can escape the surly bonds of your own block and ride over to your friend's house. It's the enchanted age. We go from unenchanted to enchanted. And then Lewis suggests in the essay, we begin to have to use the bicycle to go run some errands or to get to work or to do all of those heinous tasks. Oh my goodness, any of you ever use a bicycle on a paper route? You are in the disenchanted age. We're just using it. It's a utilitarian age. And then you grow up and you get done with bicycles and you retire, and then you can get a bicycle again and you can ride it for pleasure, and that is the re-enchanted age. And it was that word, the re-enchanted academic, that stirred in me the idea of looking at what might happen with modernism. So I'm going to begin by making a pretty big literary critical claim. I'll see if I can avoid much jargon. Please throw things at me if I begin to be unnecessarily jargonic. Is that a word? I think I made one. Jargonic. Yeah, jargonalistical. Yes, absolutely. It was a claim that I came to in my graduate studies, and but then I want to answer the most important question that you ever find in a classroom. I'm sorry, the second most important question. The first one, as all good teachers know, is, will this be on the test? The second one is, so what? And I'll see if I can't get there. Lewis says that the challenge for the critical mind, this is in the 4 loves, is not to praise or dispraise, but rather to define and describe. And in fact, what falsely gets paraded as rhetoric in so much of our heated debates these days would be tamped way down if we stopped for a moment to say, what do you mean by that word, and describe how it works. With my teenagers that I taught high school for 10 years after teaching college for a number of years, if I got them to define and describe, a lot of the debates fell away. So I want to begin by defining and describing as big a term as I can, literary modernism, or at least British literary modernism, which was my field of study. So let me give you a broad sketch of what happens in modernism. It's a period of roughly 1900 to roughly 1950. I'm imprecise and inexact, but at this point you're probably so tired you won't even notice. The brief timeline of modernism begins perhaps, well, it begins whenever it begins, but one of the key moments is in 1859 when Darwin publishes The Origin of the Species. And then you race to the fin de siècle, end of the century industrialization. You've got the centering of man. The proper study of mankind is man. Sorry for such a gendered term. It wasn't mine, and I wouldn't have used it. You have, with industrialization, people streaming into the cities. But you also have that crucial thing happening, and this is what Lewis describes in De Descriptione Temporum, his inaugural Cambridge essay that Curtis spoke about so well in the last session. You've got the distinction, not between a medieval and a Renaissance period, not between a discarded image. The distinction is between every age, before ours, and our age. Oh, yeah, I can go this way, sorry. Nope. And objective morality is that, yeah, sorry, I appear to have done something. Thank Thank you. So 1950 to 1900 to 1950. (1914 to 1918). You've got man becoming the human becoming the center of the imaginative world. You've got the mechanization bringing people into the cities, streaming into the cities, and people living there. The distinction is between the word is found in the word primitive. Primitive used to be a compliment. A primitive Baptist church is not one where they wear togas and sandals, but when they get closer to the primary truths that the apostles taught. Primitive used to be a compliment, and now it's a pejorative. Because we want the latest and the best, not the oldest and most original, and that's part of what Apple has sold us and all the rest of the technological advances. Of course, the key moment within the modernist period is 1914 to 1918. It's World War I. And I believe that we have not even begun to get over World War I, and that we are still reeling, and we're still even grasping for terms. Scientific naturalism following postmodernism. I don't think that we're over the psychic wounds that happened. As a response to that incredible tragedy that you carry with you, that we carry with us everywhere, you have, at least in the British literary circles, a kind of literary answer to that, and the annus mirabilis of modernism in England is 1922. It's James Joyce and Ulysses. It's T.S. Eliot and The Wasteland. Virginia Woolf writes Jacob's Room, and that comes out then. It's a psychological novel. So this is the period I'm talking about, the 1900 to about 1950, and much of what you see is the war poetry and then the response to what happens in the splitting apart of the world that takes place during World War I. The characteristics of literary modernism. I was told by my professor that I should stop reading Lewis and Tolkien to prepare for my exams on British literary modernism, and so I immediately did, and I began reading what characterized modernism, and I found that Lewis and Tolkien were in the heart of all of that, and that's the claim that I'll make and try to support today. British literary modernism is a movement of movements. There's imagism, there's amigism, there's the Bloomberg group, there's all of these things, and most of these little movements, futurism, they all have a manifesto. It's a small group of people trying to grapple with the new realities in the 20th century, and it's a movement made up of many movements. There's not one hidebound modernist movement. Another thing that certainly characterizes modernist literature, which is what made it such a drag for my students when I taught it, is despair. It's about hopelessness. It's a psychic response to the terror of a war where we had created machines more effective at killing each other, and not medicine more effective at healing those wounds. As noted in the industrialization, you've got people streaming into the city, and so the city features prominently. Ulysses is about a walk around Dublin. Virginia Woolf and Mrs. Dalloway is about going shopping in London. It's the city, the unreal city, Eliot says, right? They come streaming in. And then you've got fragmentation. Things fall apart. Yeats says the center cannot hold. These models no longer work because there is no middle. We are turning and turning in the widening gyre, right? There's a fragmentation of everything, and the bomb exploding into the foxhole is a symbol of what happens here at the beginning of the century. Nevertheless, modernist writers are consumed by mythology. Whether it's the Cumaean Sibyl of T.S. Eliot, or Yeats's one of his first collections, which is of Irish fairy tales. It's Ulysses, it's the telling of that story. Mythology it captivates modernist writers. Ezra Pound famously says, make it new, make it new. So in addition to fragmentation and despair in the city, there's an emphasis on innovation. Give us something brand new, and you can see the mechanization of the world taking place within the literary context. Language is another key concern of modernists. They're playing with language. Language is starting, as was pointed out, language is starting to get slippy. It's starting to not mean as much anymore. The work of Frederick Saussure and others. And then it's not, as we see in the great cathedrals, art for God's sake. And it's not even art for man's sake, as maybe the Romantics might assert. It's art for art's sake, an intense depersonalization of the movement of art. Another thing that characterizes British literary modernism is rejection. And what they reject is the 19th century. They reject Romanticism. But do you see how by rejecting Romanticism, in order to understand modernism, you have to include it? To understand what modernism is, because it defines itself by rejecting Romanticism, it ushers Romanticism in the back door. And the Inklings take advantage of this opening. It's also a rejection of religion, but so many of the modernists themselves had been believers or came from families of evangelical believers, people who took religion seriously. So not only a rejection of religion, a rejection of Romanticism, but there's also a rejection of story. That appalled me when I got to graduate school. And we're still living in that. We don't care for narrative. Give us the details. Give us Gregor Samsa. Give us the incidents. Give us the images. Don't give us a story. Disenchantment. C.S. Lewis says in French Nocturne, before he's a believer, as he comes out of the trenches in the Somme Valley, he writes a poem, and the closing line is, "Our throats can bark for slaughter, cannot sing." It is bleak. And this bleakness, in response to the bleakness that we have foisted upon each other, is what British literary modernism and many other of the artistic modernisms are grappling with. The literature, of course, that comes out of British literary modernism. Oh, we'll go back just a moment. Well, let's have a look. Many of you know this painting by Marcel Duchamp. It's the nude descending the staircase, of course. Yes. But can you not see the fragmentation that art is responding to? Ceci n'est pas un pipe, says Magritte. This is not a pipe. Is that a pipe? No, it's not a pipe. It's a painting of a pipe. It's a representation of a pipe. Ceci, we have to ask, this, does this refer to the picture of the pipe, or does this refer to the word this? Or does this even refer to the word peep? This is not a pipe. And the title of the painting, as many of you know, is Le Treason des Images, the treason of image. Meaning and language have gotten slippery, and we can't count on them anymore. And so we either respond to the fragmented world by talking about fragmentation, or like Piet Mondrian does, we organize beauty. I want to slap the people in the museums that I go into who say, oh, anybody could do that. Well, maybe anybody could do that, but Piet Mondrian is trying to establish black and white and perpendicular and color, and he's trying to recover beauty in an age where we have torn ourselves to pieces. And isn't that our age as well? The literature that comes out of this period, I've already cited it. It's The Wasteland. It's J. Alfred Prufrock, whose foot is upon the stair, and he's asking, do I dare? Do I dare? He's a lean and slippered pantaloon, and he doesn't dare. And he loses human connection. It's Ezra Pound. It's W.H. Auden. It's the war poets. But what we start to see is a curious crossbreeding with the Inklings. Because did you know that Tolkien and Auden were on a first-name basis? My dear Whiston, Tolkien writes. Auden later in his life said that Williams, Charles Williams, Lewis, and Wild Kierkegaard brought me back to faith. Lewis meets Yeats twice. There's this intersection. Roy Campbell is on the is on the scene. Williams and Eliot have a relationship. Lewis writes to Eliot, and later they become good friends. There's a real crossbreeding amongst the modernists. So I want to talk about what we mean by modernist and where do we place the Inklings. If we don't place them in modernism, where do we place them? They were writing during the modernist period. I suggest that we put them exactly where they were. And I suggest that maybe Lewis and Tolkien are reacting to modernism as modernists. They are themselves a movement. It's the Inklings. Do they have a manifesto? Anybody who's read On Fairy Stories and heard Lewis quoted in his own critical writing will say that perhaps even that's a manifesto for them. They're a movement working against the movement within modernism, which has not yet become hidebound. They were trying to move the needle of the age, and they lost the battle, but they won the war. There are not enough of the sort of books that we like to read, Lewis and Tolkien said to each other. We best write some ourselves. This is an explicit rejection of the Pounds and the Eliots and the Joyces and the Woolfs. There aren't enough of the things that we like to read. We better write some ourselves. And that's what they do. How do they do it? They do it with mythopoetic modernism. What, you might ask, does mythopoetic mean? Well, since I told you to describe and define, let me do that for you. It's two words. It's mythos, which means story. Because it comes from Greek, that's where we get the word Greek myths, but they start as stories. And it's poesis. It is workmanship. St. Paul uses the word, we are his workmanship created in Christ Jesus for good works. We are his poema. And as any of you who have ever tried to write a poem knows, if you tried to write a good poem, you craft it. And you change a word or a comma, or you throw the whole thing out and write the next poem. You work and you work and you work at it. And what Lewis and Tolkien are doing in response to the literature of their age, which are the wrong sorts of books, not addressing the things of their age in a proper way, leaving some things out, is they craft their own stories. And aren't we glad they did? If they hadn't, I wouldn't have gotten on an airplane for 18 hours to come and be here with you. It's mythopoeic modernism, but let me suggest that Lewis and Tolkien should be placed firmly within canonical modernism, and now let me see if I can justify the claim. As I've said, it's a movement of movements, and that's what you have with the Inklings. Is there any despair in Lewis and Tolkien's writing? Have you read The Last Battle? The despair of the good Narnians during the new regime? How many times does Tolkien say hopeless? They were without hope as Frodo and Sam trudged up Mount Doom. You couldn't have written a story like that with that much hopelessness and despair in any other age, I suggest, except the modernist age. Let me ask you a trick question. Who do you think the Lord of the Rings is? This is the audience participation part of the talk. Who do you think is the hero of the Lord of the Rings? The hero. Sam, yes. Frodo, yes. Who else? Who can we consider the hero of the Lord of the Rings? Aragorn, without any question, absolutely. Who else? Gandalf, of course. You know who the hero of the Lord of the Rings is? It's Smeagol. Because Frodo said at the edge of Mount Doom, it's mine. It came to me. And Frodo could not get the ring over the edge. And in fact, and how is this not the gospel proclamation within the midst of modernism? Tolkien is echoing Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard says that to be pure of heart is to will one thing. Sam entertains the notion of gardening the whole world before he gives it up. And yes, Sam gives up the ring, and he's my second choice for hero. But Smeagol doesn't want to use the ring, he just wants to have it. And that purity of heart allows the ring to be destroyed, and Frodo couldn't do it. Tell me that that's not at least in the running for a very modernist hero. The modernists are concerned with the city, and so is C.S. Lewis, and so is J.R.R. Tolkien. What's the name of the last book of The Lord of the Rings? The Return of the King, where? To the White City. He's come out of the wilderness, and he returns to the city. Lewis called Till We Have Faces far and away my best book. And what does Queen Orwell do? She sets the city to rights. She smooths down the pavement where the page boy trips. She sets up the systems of aqueducts and everything. It's about the city. They're as consumed with the city as the rest of the modernists because they were one. There's also that negative side, and so we have our prototypical modernist, the ape. Right? Shift, who wants to pave Narnia over with roads. But that mechanization of the city imbues Lewis and Tolkien's work. Fragmentation, things falling apart. The last king of Narnia kills an unarmed man. Talk about fragmentation and despair. That's exactly what's going on. Yes, Frodo gets the ring as close as he can. And yes, we think that he and Sam, as Smeagol destroys the ring and they come down the mountain and they think that they're going to die, well, the eagles come, even as the world is falling around them. And yes, Sam lives happily ever after, and the beer is good, and the tobacco is good, and Rosie is good. But Frodo cannot stay. The wound won't ever leave him. You couldn't have had a story like this in any other age. It's entirely modernist in its sensibilities, but you have these writers who say there are not enough of the sort of books. They're not rejecting modernism. They're infusing it with just a little bit of hope, because they were men of the war who survived the war with a little bit of hope. Mythology. Mythology consumes the modernists, and of course, I don't need to prove to you that Tolkien claimed to have despised Narnia because it was such a mishmash of mythologies. He says there's too many stories in there, but it was Tolkien who told Lewis that all of the stories contain truth. He's the author of the very view that he despises. Come on, Tolkien, get over yourself. Lewis's best book is Till We Have Faces, a Myth Retold. Tolkien looks at the literary history of England and sees that Arthur begins by recalling Troy, and there's a gap between the fall of Troy in 1200 BC and the beginning of Arthur in 500 AD, and so he writes The Lord of the Rings as a mythology for England. That's his phrase. And if you think of the beginning of the Fourth Age, the Age of Men, you can see Aragorn as the proto-Arthur. And Tolkien is writing a mythology that fits in the gap in between Troy and Arthur, and that's what those three ages are. Make it new, Ezra Pound says. Innovate. But Lewis and Tolkien know that there is no ex nihilo creation. You can't make anything new. The only one who can make anything new is the one who, thanks be to God, makes all things new. You can't innovate, but Tolkien and Lewis keenly saw that you can renovate. Lewis's first book of critical essays is called Rehabilitations. He's going to the past and saying, you've missed out on some things. Let's go get the medieval stuff that you have too hastily cast aside. They're echoing the sentiment that you find in G.K. Chesterton, that the Christian ideal, along with so many other things, has not been tried and found wanting. It's been found difficult and left untried. And Lewis and Tolkien say, let's try it even though it seems difficult. Tolkien's mission on the cusp of going to war, the TCBS charges him with this mission, that he had been granted some spark of fire. These are Tolkien's words reporting the meeting with his friends at 19 or so. He had been granted some spark of fire, Tolkien had, that was destined to kindle a new light, or what is much the same thing, rekindle an old light in the world. And he was destined to testify for God and truth. This is what Tolkien took into the trenches. To renovate, to try again, to look around at the bleakness of the world where we're surrounded by fake news and try to find some good news that we can rely on. Language? Oh my goodness. Yes, language. Tolkien invents 14 of them for the Lord of the Rings, and then he renovates Anglo-Saxon, right, with the writers of Rohan. Lewis is responding against the mishmashing of neologisms like Tashlin, and he is reinvigorating language, and Orwell's whole project is about writing in language. And I use the Greek my master told me, and words, until that word can be dug out of us, how can we know the things that we mean to say? Lewis and Tolkien are all about language. If you don't believe it, try to struggle your way through studies in words. Art for art's sake? Well, they knew that was a lie. They knew everything. Art, life, war, everything was for God's sake. These were men committed, especially during the 40s and the 50s, committed to living that light in their culture. In 1955, the American theologian Carl F.H. Henry writes to Lewis and asks him for more of the kinds of articles that he did all through the 40s, those kind of apologetic theological articles. And Lewis says this, I can't write your articles for you. My thought and talent, such as they are, now flow in different, though I think not less Christian channels, and I do not think I am at all likely to write more directly theological pieces. If I am now good for anything, Lewis says, it is for catching the reader unawares through fiction and symbol. I have done what I could in the way of frontal attacks, but I now feel sure those days are over. Look at the battle language. I'm going to write indirect theology as an act of war. Lewis and Tolkien are trying to move the modernist age, and they lose that battle. But how many people do you know who reread Ulysses on a regular basis for fun? But how many of us have reread The Lord of the Rings more times than we would like to count? They're still winning that war. He writes this in 1955, Lewis does. That's a few months after he gets done writing Till We Have Faces, and this is a whole nother talk and another paper for another time. In the act of writing Till We Have Faces, falls in love with Joy Davidman, who writes it with him. It's right as he has finished writing Narnia. He's writing indirect theology as a way of worming its way into culture and re-enchanting not only the academy, but everything. Why? Why are they mythopoetic modernists? There's your mythos and poesis. There are your characteristics. Here's your big question. Why? It's a response. Because, as Lewis points out and rightly sees, it's a response to the modernist age. It's a renovative effort to say you've got the right things and have read them the wrong way. And it's rehabilitation. But let's get back to bicycles. Lewis and Tolkien had been unenchanted enchanted, and certainly Lewis was disenchanted. And as Holly Ordway has pointed out in her marvelous new book, Tolkien's Faith, Tolkien's Catholic faith practice had gotten a little dry. The thing that reinvigorated Tolkien's Catholic faith was bearing witness to the gospel in the life of C.S. Lewis. He comes alive again as a practicing Catholic as he tries to carry this truth and fulfill his mission to rekindle an old light. Lewis and Tolkien's effort is re-enchanting. And they are offering, I think, a very valid and reliable re-enchantment into a world where they are avoiding none of the difficult questions, but answering them. So, what, you say? It's not on the test. But we will talk about bicycles, and I think that this model of re-enchantment works very well. And I have been moved literally to tears with some of the stories of the way that C.S. Lewis in this country is still a name to conjure with. A few of us today were in a room crammed with so many high school students that they could barely make space for us to sit down, and they're thinking about re-enchantment, and they're thinking about fantasy as a way to mitigate and mediate and live their lives in our contemporary age, and they were hanging on every word. I wish that they had had at least one better speaker than they had out of the four of us. As academics in a postmodern academy, as intellectuals in a post-communist world, even a post-truth world, here's what Lewis says. He says, and I'll have to disagree with him, which is rare, but I'll do it. The job of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. And maybe that was true 80 years ago, but now the job of the teacher, of the academic, of the living intellectual, believing intellectual in our contemporary world, the job is absolutely to cut down the jungles of noise and anger. Let's not please call it rhetoric when we talk about political discourse. There's nothing of those noble arts in our modern arguments and hatreds for each other. Twitter is not rhetoric. It's not even Twitter anymore, but that's a different story. Yes, let's irrigate those deserts, but let's also cut down jungles. Do you think I am trying to weave a spell? Lewis says. Perhaps I am. But remember your fairy tales. Spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as for inducing them, and you and I have need of the strongest spell that can be found to wake us from the evil enchantment of worldliness that has been laid upon us for over 100 years. Rilian, after he is rescued in the silver chair and in the last battle, is called Rilian the Disenchanted. Susan wasn't old enough to start reading fairy tales again. I hope by the end of her life she was. Lewis certainly offers some hope for her. Let us get over the disenchantment that is so the coin of the realm in our day, and let us make it new again. Let us renew it. Peter. Lucy sees a robin. Peter says, let's follow it. Edmund, that little jerk, says, how do we know which side the robin is on? And Peter leads his brother and sisters into this frozen wasteland of a world, into a deadly fate. And Peter does it because he says, well, robins, you know, good birds in all the books that I've ever read. This suggests an epistemology of reading. Continue, academics, to read, and not only to prep for your classes, but read those things that you love. Whenever I quote Narnia in an academic conference, I watch all these hardened academics just kind of drift back to when they were 8 years old. If you need to go back there and read for pleasure again, do. There's plenty of good stuff. Don't stop. Do. Let me end with my favorite character. I love Lucy. Her name, of course, refers to the Latin lux lucus, light. She is an echo of Saint Lucy, the patron saint of the blind. You see Saint Lucy carrying eyes in her iconography, and we pray to Saint Lucy when we have eye problems. Lucy sees everything. You know why she's the one who runs to get the hatchet on the dawn treader when the sea serpent wraps around? Because, if you watch it carefully, she knows where everything is. She sees everything. And I used to think that she sees because she believes, but that's not quite true. She's a little afraid. She doesn't always believe. But I began to understand that she sees because she loves. She pities Tumnus and sees the best in him, even though he has sold her. He has taken the money for her. She pities Edmund. She pities Eustace. Lucy sees because she loves. She's given 2 gifts from Father Christmas. What are they? The dagger, which we never hear about again, and the cordial. A cordial is a drink that revives the heart. It's contained in a bottle, which is also called a cordial, which comes from the Latin corde, meaning heart. Lucy's gift is the gift of the heart, and the gift of the heart heals others. Lucy sees because she loves. Lewis says love is where we go out of ourselves towards the other. Lucy's the opposite of a man without a chest. She's a girl so full of heart that she sees everything and brings us along with her to see everything as well. So let us enter back into a re-enchanted academy, or if it's not re-enchanted yet, let us re-enchant ourselves, ask God to re-enchant us, and go back in and shine that rekindled light. And following Lucy, let us follow the 2 great commandments: to love our Creator by diving into creativity and explaining it, by making, by reading, by analyzing and painting and talking about the vast world of creative things, looking all the while and leading our students to look all the while for the hints of a Creator even in his absence, his apparent absence. Of course, Jack Lewis helps us by saying that God walks through the world everywhere incognito. Malcolm Guite reminds us that we see God now disguised as everything. Academics, see that, follow Lucy, and bring that to your students who are dying to hear some glimmer of hope. Let us love our neighbors. Lewis says, I must see with other eyes. Let us go into coffee shops tonight and read poetry. Let's go into cafes. Let's shine light in the darkness. This world is satisfied with itself and it's drowning in despair. But we have another answer, don't we? And so I'll close with the end of the book that started it all for Denise. This love that God calls us to as re-enchanted academics, and that Lewis and Tolkien have modeled for us. Let's follow that way of love. Here's how Mere Christianity ends, and here's where I shall end too. Give up yourself, and you will find your real self. Lose your life, and you will save it. Submit to death, death of your ambitions and favorite wishes every day, and death of your whole body in the end. Submit with every fiber of your being, and you will find eternal life. Keep back nothing. Nothing that you have not given away will really be yours. Nothing in you that has not died will ever be raised from the dead. Look for yourself, and you will find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But look for Christ, and you will find him, and with him, everything else thrown in. Thank you.
but we'll give this to our next speaker, David McIlroy, who is our final speaker and final keynote speaker, talking on mere legality, C.S. Lewis on objective morality, natural law, and the rule of law.
I've learned many things during this conference, one of which is if you're the last speaker on, please get everybody to stand up and shake before we start.
Okay, that's enough. Sit down. We got a PowerPoint going up?
I'm hoping so. So this is the 6th edition of the C.S. Lewis conference. I'm hoping the PowerPoint is going to appear. But whilst it does, let me say this. It appears to be the first time that it has been addressed by a lawyer. Now,
Every cloud has a silver lining.
this may be, of course, because lawyers have no imagination. And when the PowerPoint eventually appears and you see how prosaic it is, I will have done nothing to dispel that illusion. I'm faced with the task of talking to an audience almost entirely of non-lawyers. I'm very grateful that the Dean of the Faculty of Law here and one of her colleagues have come along, so hopefully there will be at least 2 people in this audience who understand me. And it's very important because, in fact, they've been teaching law here for 5 years longer than there's been a university. So, frankly, it is a disgrace that you've not had anybody coming to speak to the concerns of lawyers. But I'm hoping to be able to communicate with the rest of you as well. So what I want to do is work outwards from C.S. Lewis's interest in law. He was the son of a lawyer. He wrote about the foundations of positive law in a series of 3 philosophical lectures published under the title The Abolition of Man. And the 3rd novel in his scientific trilogy, That Hideous Strength, he expressly described as a novel whose moral was the serious point he was trying to make in The Abolition of Man. It's right to say that there's not been much attention for half a century or so to his thinking about law. But we have had in the last decade Michael Ward publish a critical commentary on The Abolition of Man. Justin Buckley Dyer and Michael Watson have published a book in which they look at his views on politics and natural law and describe the abolition of man as the linchpin for understanding all his work. And the British atheist philosopher John Gray, who was an acute cultural critic, described the abolition of man on the BBC in 2015 as prescient, prophetic, and more relevant now than ever. We've heard a couple of times during the course of this conference about the 2-stage conversion of Lewis. And the abolition of man really, it goes to his first conversion. It goes to his concern that he needed to rediscover his faith in objectivity, in objective truth, in objective goodness, in objective beauty, before he could then go on and begin even to consider seriously the claims of Christianity. And this concern for objective truth and objective goodness and objective beauty runs through all of the disciplines, or it should. We've had Professor Snyder during the course of this event telling us how not to teach history. Dr. Jeffrey Johnson telling us how and why to teach literature. We are moving on now to think about aesthetics, a moral philosophy and law and linguistics, creative writing, psychology, education, pedagogy. How all of these are affected if you lose your faith in objectivity. So in the book, The Abolition of Man, he seeks to defend what the cold-hearted villain Frost calls, in that hideous strength, that preposterous idea of an external standard of value. For Lewis, commitment to an idea of an external objective standard of value is essential. His big claim is that the dogmatic belief in objective value is necessary to the very idea of a rule of law which is not tyranny, or an obedience which is not slavery. And he denounces as the disease that will certainly end our species if it is not crushed, the fatal superstition that men can create values. And there's a real urgency to his concern about the rejection of objective morality leading to tyranny and destruction. I'm not sure if he was aware of the pogrom that had happened in Iași in 1941, but he was certainly aware of the mass extermination of the Jews by the Nazis as the news began to filter into the Western press from June 1942 onwards. And so Lewis says, if there's no set of moral values that are truer or better than any other, there is no sense in preferring civilized morality to savage morality, or Christian morality to Nazi morality. The moment you say one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are in fact measuring them both by a standard, saying one of them is closer to that standard than the other. Unless the measuring rod is different from the thing that is being measured, you cannot say anything. And so Lewis sees objective morality as a universal absolute, binding on all human beings over time and space. He calls it the Tao, in order to de-emphasize Western categories, to remind his readers that moral reality is universal. And he wants to remind his readers that the Tao is not something human beings simply make up, it is something that they discover. And indeed, against historicism, against the naive belief in progress, he says you have to know where you're going in order to know whether you're progressing or regressing. Except on the supposition of a changeless standard, progress is impossible. If good is a fixed point, then it's at least possible that we should get nearer and nearer to it. Our ideas of the good may change, but they cannot change either for the better or the worse if there is no absolute and immutable good to which they can approximate or from which they can recede. And he's worried about this not just for intellectual integrity. He is worried about it because denying objective morality removes all limits on the power some human beings have over others. He's vehemently opposed to subjectivism because of the damage it does to practical reason, to our judgment of good and evil. If good means only the local ideology, how can those who invent the local ideology be guided by any idea of the good themselves? Lewis thought the controllers will manipulate the rest of the populace. In chapter 2 of The Magician's Nephew, the magician, Uncle Andrew, says people like me, men like me in fact, are freed from the common rules. His nephew, Diggory, who Ross has immortalized in sculpture, sees that what Uncle Andrew means is that he thinks he can do anything he likes to get anything he wants. In that hideous strength, Lewis seeks to illustrate the truth of this claim in ways that are painful for academics. Mark Studdock, the junior academic, wants to be part of the in crowd, what C.S. Lewis calls in the essay, the inner ring. And that inner ring in the book is the progressive element at Braxton College. But of course he exposes the folly of the attempt to become part of the inner ring because those progressive academics don't really understand what's going on. They're being manipulated by Lord Feverstone, the immoral businessman, the man with his hands on the endowment. Lewis portrays him as the embodiment of Homo economicus, the rational maximizer of his own preferences, who is wholly indifferent to the demands of morality, the interests of others, or the common good. And Feverstone tricks the academics into selling the college's property to the technocrats at Nice. Feverstone, in turn, for all his privilege, turns out to be just an instrument for those in the next inner ring, the inner ring at Nice, and so on and so on and so on, until the entire system is at the mercy of two individuals. Oh, listen to their names: Frost and Wither. Now, although Lewis's analysis would apply to a party in a one-party state, he deliberately sets his novel in the West, because he believes the loss of the commitment to objective morality can occur whatever a country's political system. He chose a university because he wanted to show the deadly consequences of the rejection of the idea of objective morality being taught by his academic colleagues at Oxford. What he wants to show is the outworking of the philosophy of logical positivism in vogue in Oxford University in his day. But his genius is that his critique is not limited to that philosophy or to that moment. He identifies in that hideous strength that the replacement of truth by mere power can happen for any number of reasons. Some, like Feverstone and Frost, delight in the pursuit of power for its own sake. They get off on it. Others, such as Wither, succumb to the reductive fallacy that power is the only reality because they've become disenchanted. They've lost faith in objective truth. They've fallen prey to the mistake of assuming that because people's physical and emotional situations influence their moral values, morality is a mere subjective byproduct of the physical and economic situations of different human beings. Logical positivism is just one manifestation of this. Lewis thought that the poison of subjectivism had opened the door to the power philosophies of the totalitarian states, but he saw it as going deeper and spreading wider, infecting the liberal democracies of the West as well as their fascist and communist opponents. Many a popular planner on a democratic platform, many a mild-mannered scientist in a democratic laboratory means, in the last resort, just what the fascist means. He believes that good means whatever men are conditioned to approve. In The Abolition of Man, he's too polite to name them, but he gives us the mild-eyed scientist, the popular dramatist, and the amateur philosopher as the stalking horses for the abolition of objective morality. And A.M. Wilson, in his biography of C.S. Lewis, says, well, this is Sigmund Freud, the scientist, George Bernard Shaw, the dramatist, A.J. Ayer, the philosopher. If he were writing today, he'd add the CEO of the multinational company, or the technology guru armed with science, but not driven by any philosophy of human nature or societal good. For Lewis, nothing less than the future of the human race is at stake. The humanity Lewis thought was being destroyed was the understanding of human beings as free, as moral agents, and as possessing inherent dignity. And his fear was that once objective morality has ceased to be acknowledged and ceased to be taught, subsequent generations may be so blinded that they are unable to see objective morality at all. He thought that if we lose belief in objective morality, we'll lose the ability to engage in rational, moral, and political argument. Anybody seen any evidence of that loss happening? And he was therefore concerned about natural law. Natural law is for Lewis the ordered rhythm of the universe, epitomized in the music of the spheres. Nature itself, and in particular human nature, has a special role in defining for us what is right and wrong, just and unjust, important and unimportant. It's not an unknown transcendental. It's something human beings have access to through the natural light. It was Owen Barfield who convinced him that if thought were merely a subjective event, there would be no way to secure a trustworthy awareness of truth or goodness or beauty. There must be some more fundamental connection between the human mind and the world at large, as Bruce was indicating in his talk a little earlier. And because of this commitment to the importance of nature, of human nature, who are the enemies that oppose nice in that hideous strength? Merlin, who symbolizes the wisdom of the ages, and Mr. Bultitude the bear, who symbolizes the natural world. They're the ones who come and are able to help overcome the technocrats who have become obsessed with their own power and forgotten the purpose. Now, in The Abolition of Man, Lewis appeals to common themes in morality across different cultures, not to establish the ontological existence of natural law, but rather to assert that the moral truth is not unknowable. In many places, and at many times, and in many schools of thought, something of the contours of moral truth, and therefore the outline of a shared conception of human good, has been recognized. I think Lewis would have smiled when in 2019, a group of anthropologists from Oxford University published a study looking across 60 different human cultures and concluded that there were 7 forms of cooperative behavior considered morally good in all cultures. Helping kin, helping your group, reciprocating, being brave, part of what Lewis saw as chivalrous, deferring to your superiors, dividing disputed resources, respecting prior possession. These things, in many places and at many times, we recognize as right. Now, there are questions that can be raised about whether Lewis actually provides in The Abolition of Man a successful philosophical explanation for the reasons why people come to recognize the natural law. I don't have time, I think, to cover that. But it is really, really important, and probably the only original discovery in the context of this paper, that he called his college, where he set that hideous strength, Bracton College. Henry de Bracton, the father of the common law, who wrote, "The law makes the king." Joyce Macpherson in her talk this morning, we had King Loon of Archenland quoting that line. And it's a quote. And Lewis knew exactly who Bracton was and referred to Bracton in the same breath as Aquinas when he's writing about the history of English literature in the 16th and 17th century. Lewis could see what Bracton had got at the heart of the common law tradition of which I am a practitioner. The law makes the king, and there is no king where bare will rules rather than law. So for Lewis, recognition of the natural law is essential to guard freedom. And when this is forgotten, when the law of nature is forgotten, then we are at the mercy of our rulers, our educators, our conditioners. If Lewis was writing today, he would say we are at the mercy of those who devised the algorithm. And there is room when we forget the importance of freedom and the way that freedom can only be exercised within objectivity. That we run into the vices of tyranny, servility, rebellion, remissiveness, all sorts of ways in which what happens is the ruled and the rulers collaborate together to misunderstand the purpose for which rule is to be exercised and how to respond to it appropriately. Now, Lewis is not saying law is the same as morality. But what he is saying is that natural law forms an objective framework within which human lawmaking, law following, and law breaking must take place. The idea of the law binding even the most powerful comes to a crescendo, of course, in Lewis's most popular book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The deep magic and the deeper magic. What is this? These are the laws of Narnia. These are the rules by which the great battle between the White Witch and Aslan fight. So for Lewis, the natural law is the objective, unified moral order. It has that coherence that Bruce was talking about, within which the recognition of human dignity, the discovery of what freedom truly means, and the acknowledgement of the duties and rights we have in relation to one another are harmonized. Natural law plays a key role in defending and defining freedom. It's been really great to be in Iași and to cross the roads. I've been to different European countries, and different European countries have different attitudes to those little green lights. You know, in Germany, you have to obey them under strict pain of death. In Britain, you have to obey them unless nobody's coming, in which case you can go. But actually, if there were no signs, if there were no road traffic rules, would people have more freedom to drive and get around, or less? Our freedom to travel takes place when it is trammeled, when it is given boundaries within which to operate. And that was part of Lewis's objection to the new sexual morality that he saw running through from the 20s and onwards. He said, these people say, well, they want us to treat sex naturally, but they're actually asking us to treat it in a way in which we treat no other instinct. We know that all other instincts work well if they are kept within certain boundaries. And what he predicted would happen was that once we took the guardrails off in relation to sexual morality, we'd end up with the guardrails going on all other sorts of morality as well. Now, Lewis goes on, I don't really have time to develop this, but he goes on actually here with a concern that begins with a concern about desert. Objective truth, objective goodness, objective beauty are all about learning what things are worth, and therefore ordering our loves appropriately. And he thinks that has all sorts of spin-offs in relation to crime. He was particularly bothered about what he saw as the humanitarian theory of punishment, which says that punishment is really just about reforming the antisocial criminal or deterring others. And he says if you cut the link with desert, two things happen. One is you have no clue, if you are guilty, how long you're going to be detained. And two, questions of crime and punishment become matters for therapeutic experts. And there's that incredibly poignant moment in That Hideous Strength, where the thief, who's just come to the end of his sentence, finds that on the day of his release, he's being transferred for reparative treatment in a nice institution. And when you get there, you don't even need guilt. Those who are antisocial, who need re-education, get moved. So there's tyranny that we see there. Part of Lewis's medievalism was his conviction that Henri de Bracton was right to identify that Christianity had given a basis for the rule of law built around the idea that until proven otherwise, people are free and lawful. And that's the conception that the misguided fellows of Bracton College in that hideous strength were fatally undermining. It's something that many of our colleagues in Western universities continue to undermine. And so we have a calling, I think, a proper scholarly calling. Not an apologetic calling per se, but a proper part of our scholarly calling to defend objectivity wherever it may be. I had a history master who used to take a bunch of uncultured 14-year-old boys to a concert hall to get us to listen to Mahler. I have to confess, I got very little out of listening to Mahler as a 14-year-old. But I have returned to Mahler in my 40s and could see what that history master wanted to show me. That Mahler was music it was worth getting to appreciate. I suspect he would have been too busy now trying to get us to pass the exam than to have time to give us an education, to give us tools for life, understanding of beauty, discovery of goodness. And C.S. Lewis thought that this might mean we need to reorganize our priorities. We might need to abandon some of our utilitarianism. In chapter 4 of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Caspian goes to the Lone Islands and discovers that the slave trade has re-emerged there. Gumpus, the governor of the Lone Islands, seeks to defend the slave trade on the grounds it was always defended: economic necessity. Caspian challenges the premise, but then rules that even if the slave trade were necessary to bring into the islands meat or bread or beer or wine or timber or cabbages, it must be stopped. Treating people as instruments of others can never be justified on economic grounds. Now, Lewis makes his great contributions on natural law at a really interesting moment, just after the Nazi horrors are coming to light, but before the adoption of the great international human rights instruments of the mid-20th century. He died before the full effects of the sexual revolution in the West in the 1960s had been seen. But it's possible to anticipate what he might have said in response to fragmentation. G.K. Chesterton said, "The virtues have gone mad because they've been isolated from each other and are wandering alone." Lewis would have agreed. He would have commented on today's debates that rights have swollen to madness because they've been isolated from one another and from duties. He'd remind us that when all that says it is good has been debunked, what says I want remains. The rejection of objectivity leaves us with no point of reference beyond our subjective wills. And so we need to teach again how to learn to love the things that are worth loving, how to love them wisely and rightly, in whatever discipline it is that we are called to teach. Because we live, don't we, in a moment where we've not only come to think it's impossible to obey objective morality, not only have we come to think that it's impossible to know objective morality, we've come to doubt the existence of it. And our task as educators is to begin to teach the necessity of objective truth and objective good and objective beauty as the foundation for knowing and loving. As one of our speakers said on the book launch, if we're called to know and we're called to love, we need to learn what it is to love and what there is to love. And then we need to show our students pathways towards knowing. And then, of course, we come to something that may require a little more. You see, Lewis tried, after he had returned to objective morality, to live in accordance with his conscience. And he found he couldn't do it. And that's why he was always a bit fuzzy about where the difference between philosophy and theology is. Because he thought whenever you take philosophy seriously, you should end up with religion. Thank you.
Take about 5-10 minutes for some questions. Make sure they're questions and not secret speeches that you didn't have a chance to give earlier. Raise your hand. The man with the microphone will come. Okay, we have someone over here.
My question goes to David McIlroy. Thank you very much for this moving and inspiring talk. If I got you right, then Henry de Bracton said that men are free and lawful until proven otherwise. And this quote just hit me because what happened during the COVID period was the exact opposite. People were assumed being guilty, let's say, of being transmitters of a virus, being basically polluters of public health, until proven otherwise. So the onus was shifted completely from people. So they had to prove they were not, transmitters of a virus, instead of assuming what had been assumed until then, as a given fact that when people are sick, then it shows itself. Then they have symptoms and so forth, and then everybody knows that they're sick. So it seems to me, and it fits in completely with my impression of the whole COVID period, that this was not just about fighting a virus. This was an occasion
for people didn't know what they were dealing with and were terrified about what would happen, and that was true of the leaders as well. So I don't think there's a sort of malign spirit necessarily animating what was being done. But I think part of Lewis's point in The Abolition of Man is, as he said, it is the mild-eyed scientist who's over-exaggerating their power. He was deeply worried about the tyranny of somebody who thought that they knew best and didn't have any sense of the proper limits that some men ought to have over other men. And he does use those terms, or in gendered ways, which I wouldn't, but that's what he did in his writing.
Good, thank you.
Towards the very end, you said that we should start teaching our students objective truth and objective beauty. And this is not just for you, but maybe for the other speakers as well, if they want to jump into it. How do you teach objective beauty and objective truth to students?
So So aesthetics is notoriously one of the most difficult areas, philosophically speaking. But I think, for me, my method in my subject has been to ask that kind of, well, if this is right, where does this go? And in law, it's very simple. In law, ultimately, law rests on a combination of power and justice. Now, justice has to be orientated in order to make sense to objective morality. So if you say that link is broken, we can't rely on that link, you are just left with power. And at that point, it's like, right, well, Nietzsche was right. Now, are you prepared to go where Nietzsche went? Yeah, and you'll find that very few people are prepared to go where Nietzsche went. Well, so if that's where one road ends, and this is the other road. Now, I think you can do all sorts of sophisticated things, and I did in a 2019 book called The End of Law. There's a shameless plug, to say that there can be all sorts of gaps between our understanding of the moral purposes of the law and what true reality and true morality requires. But the ruler who is just saying, do this because I want you to do it, and the ruler is saying, doing this because it's the right thing to do, they're making very different claims.
Andrew? Or
I think what you said, Paul, was exactly right, that we should believe in them ourselves. And a few weeks ago, I was in Chicago, and it struck me, even as I was in the modernist wing, that it is an objectively true thing and good thing to be in the presence of beautiful things. Be in the presence of things, even if I might not agree with the art or enjoy the artistic sensibilities, to expose myself to carefully crafted art, right? And to put myself in there, to take my students to Mahler or whatever, and to inhabit that. I think that if you talk about the objectively beautiful, the objectively good in my craft, what I do every week is what Lewis says in Mere Christianity: the habit of faith must be trained, because it won't stay in the mind. And so that's why we expose ourselves regularly to Scripture and to fellowship and to, and to worship and to sacrament. Because if I want to be good, I have to expose myself to the good. And I have to rejoice in the good, right? In Ephesians it says, whatever is noble, whatever is worthy of praise. That's not whatever Christian is worthy of praise. It's if anything is worthy of praise. And so to be looking for those things. And then as Christians, we must tend very carefully to our spiritual lives, right? We must tend to them. I find, frankly, and I wish that it weren't the case, when I don't read my Bible every day, after a couple of days I get grumpy with my wife. And it only took me, 3 or 4 years to realize that it wasn't her fault. That I need the adjustment of that absolute truth in order to realign myself. And so I think Paul's comment was entirely true. We need to expose ourselves to those things.
So if you have further questions or comments that you would like to talk with our speakers about, come up afterward. I'll take the privilege of saying the philosopher Roger Scruton wrote once, if somebody tells you that all things are relative, there is no truth, agree with them and don't listen. So, Denisa, do you want to come forward? Yes, let's give our...
of the time that you are here. But before parting, let's say, I would like to thank you for being here for this memorable 2 days, actually 3 days for some of you. It has been amazing. As I said today, it was the only time in these 10 years when we had leaves and sun and warmth. And you could see that this city is beautiful. Also, we had 45 speakers from more than 13 countries. It is amazing that we are here to talk about this heritage together in a city like Iași, in this very university. So I will shorten it up. I will thank, first of all, to all the participants who didn't have a presentation. Can you believe that there were people who came to attend the conference not to speak, just to listen? I would like them to stand up and we will thank them. And they are from very different countries, including a student from Italy, from Bologna. Can you stand up, please? Well, as much as I love the professors, I still love students more, so, as you can see. Then I would like to thank the volunteers. We have had some wonderful volunteers. Some of them have grown with these conferences. They were like pupils when we started, and now they are students in this university. So let's thank them. And stand. You too. Yeah. And of course, the technical team. They did a great job. And well, everybody who worked there for so long. And even they like it or not, they had to listen to all of this. And they know some English, and they told me that they liked it. Actually, they attended 2 years ago, and they came back this time. So we can add another dimension to our interdisciplinarity. Yes, and then let me see if I've. Yes, we need to thank the artists. Would the artists stand? Please stand up. Wherever you are, would you please stand up? I was delighted. Maybe I will say it because it's so difficult to bend over this. I was delighted that some of them said that actually they enjoyed being with their, works, wonderful works, but they enjoyed more to listen to the talks. So we corrupted them, and I told them, maybe we should get better in imagining things, and you will get better in using words. So we can work together on this. And then what's? Yes, let's thank the translators. You're right. The interpreters. Would you please stand? Thank you so much for your hard work. You've been wonderful. And it's amazing that you are ready to do this. And now it's time to thank the speakers, right? So I will call each one of you, and please not only stand up, but come in front, okay? So, Mr. Professor Douglas Hadley. Dr. David Roy. Dr. Paul Michelson. Dr. Ellen Snyder. Dr. Bruce Little. Maybe I should have said philosopher, historian. I'm so excited about this part, I keep saying, this is a theologian, this is a professor in literature, and so a distinguished philosopher. Mr. Charles White, a distinguished historian. Dr. Kirsten Johnson. Reverend Andrew Laszlo. Dr. Daryl McCarthy. Dr. Joe Rickey. Dr. Karen Coates. Dr. Jeffrey Hippolito. Oh, he's not here. I'm sorry. He was on Zoom. Dr. John Lotz. Dr. Danuț Mănăstireanu. Dr. Sarah Waters. Dr. Melody Green. Dr. Anne Frederica Balero. Dr. Joyce McPherson. Lindsay Thompson. Lindsay. Dr. Donna Povolescu. Dr. Aline Cuckoo. Dr. Marius Klim. And our beloved PhD students and MA students who are here with us, Curtis White, Olivia Simoni, Theodora Hriscu. Maybe you should remain. Oh, is it possible for you or to stay here, David? How is it better? Yep, good. Estera Federechuk, Bogdan Desnan, Florin is not with us, Natalie Morel, Cătălin Bogdan Țermure, Jasmine Metcalf, Ryan Jeffrey, and the most amazing artist, Ross Wilson. Well, well, we might need a bigger stage for the next one. Yeah. And of course, you kept saying, Denise, because I'm just the loud one, but actually, we are the true, you know, we are like truth, love, and beauty, you know. It's me, but I couldn't have done, I mean, I wouldn't have been able to do anything without Dr. Teodora Giviriga, and we invite her here. And for our 10th anniversary, I declare the hero of the conference as being Dr. Rodica Albu. Because she is the first translator of C.S. Lewis in Romania, and she was the one who had a completely open heart to start this adventure of organizing the conference, even it was so crazy 10 years ago. So.
All right. Okay, we're forgetting someone, or a couple of someones. Denisa and her husband and their 3 slave-treated children. So let's give them a round of applause.
And flowers are nice, but if I can take a moment of priestly privilege, I brought from my collection in Florida 3 first editions, one for each of the 3 organizers. Present Concerns, which contains the essay about re-enchantment, Letters to Malcolm chiefly on prayer, and The Great Divorce. And you 3 can fight out who gets which.
I will just add this. So I forgot Raluca, and she's here. So you can take another picture. But I want to underline this. Not only that we had these great talks, but all these professors were ready to sacrifice to go to school. So in the activities of the conference, we visited 4 schools in our city. And we are having 3 meetings at night with young people, and they were all ready to be part of it and being in panels and in exactly like in Lewis's heart. So bridging academia with people, with students, with real life, and yes, being ready to be part of re-enchantment of the people's life. So I want to thank you so much.
Denise,
Having been said, our conference is over. Yeah, would you like to?
was it you had asked me to remind you in case, because the end is so full. Denise asked if I would invite you all to something next year. We're going to have to wait 2 years before we're back in Iași. However, next year is the bicentenary of the birth of George MacDonald. And there are going to be conferences in many different places, but at the Wade Center, at Wheaton, June, I think it's 21, 22, 23, there's going to be a 3-day conference combining artists and authors and academics, and it's going to be a marvelous conference. Joe, Ricky, and some others are going to get up to some hijinks with theater and music. Malcolm Geit is going to do an evening gig. There is also at Yale going to be a day event on December the 13th, a day symposium, and Yale has decided it's crazy they've not done anything on MacDonald yet, so they hope to make this a bicentennial event. So next year will be the first time, and they think that MacDonald needs to be taken more seriously, and so they're taking this one on. And I wrote this down because I don't trust my brain. The third one is, of course, St. Andrews. So especially for you, those of you in Europe, there is also going to be a 2-day event in St. Andrews University in Scotland. And that will be sometime in November. The exact date isn't pinned down. But I won't read you the whole list, but for the centenary event of George MacDonald, 100 years ago, the chairman was G.K. Chesterton. The president of the committee to organize for the centenary was the Prime Minister of England, Ramsay MacDonald. Also on the committee were A.S. Peake of Peake's Commentaries, Ernest Reist, who is the founder of Everyman's Library, novelist John Galsworthy, James Barrie, who wrote Peter Pan, W.B. Yeats, whose name we've heard multiple times, Catherine Tynan, A.S. Watt, who was Britain's first literary agent. There were famous authors, politicians, artists, dancers, suffragists, bishops, people from multiple denominations and non-English, Irish, Welsh, and Scottish. Let's make 2024 even better.
I'm so happy that it's next year and not in 2025, because then we will meet again.